It's never been easier to have sex. Birth control is ubiquitous, there are less social taboos about sex, and you don't need a serious or even casual relationship partner. Just jump on Tinder and off you go. So why is it that teenagers and young adults are having less sex than previous generations? Now, before you jump in with your hot takes about how it's porn, video games, the Me Too movement, or the plethora of other distractions that don't require human interaction, I would invite you to read this more than 12,000 word article in The Atlantic from December 2018. And if you haven't got the attention span for that, you could watch the accompanying 3-minute video, also by The Atlantic, although it doesn't do the article justice. Now, to be clear, this article doesn't have unambiguous answers either. How could it? It's a deeply complex issue, but it does cover a lot of ground and has some interesting data and anecdotes which I'll draw from, as well as some areas that I think are lacking. But first, let's have a look at some broad data to see what's happening in the sex lives of Americans. And for this, I'm going to use a Washington Post article published on March 29th this year, titled, "The Share of Americans Not Having Sex Has Reached a Record High." So the author draws on data from the General Social Survey showing that over the past 30 years, the percentage of Americans that had no sex in the prior 12 months was almost 1 in 4. Significantly less are having sex on a weekly basis and slightly more on a monthly basis. So presumably some of those that were having sex weekly are now having it monthly. Now, as the article states, one factor is obviously age. The 60 and older demographic grew from 18% of the population in 1996 to 26% in 2018. And because older people have less sex, that has the effect of lowering the average for the overall population. However, the second chart eliminates the 60 and older category and shows quite clearly the lack of sex is driven mainly by the 18 to 29-year-old age group. As the Atlantic article notes, this is attributed by some experts to the fact that for 25 years, fewer people have been marrying, and those that do marry later in life. Even the rise of cohabitating couples hasn't risen enough to offset the decline in marriage. And so people who live with a romantic partner tend to have sex more than those who don't. Those that aren't married are about 3 times as likely to have not had sex in the past year. The Atlantic article notes about 60% of adults under age 35 now live without a spouse or a partner, and 1 in 3 adults in this age range live with their parents, making it tougher to get it on. Now, here's where I think it gets interesting. The decline in sex is being driven by young men. As you can see, the percentage of men and women in this age group reporting no sex in the prior year was fairly even until the last decade. The number of young men reporting not having sex in the past year is 28%, compared to 18% for women in the same age group. And here's an even more startling statistic. The percentage of men under 30 reporting they've had 0 sex since they turned 18 has tripled from just a decade ago to 27%. Now, some such as Jean Twenge, professor of psychology and author of the book iGen, says this trend is related to falling labour participation among young men, particularly in the aftermath of the Great Recession. This correlates with the fact that you are more likely to have a romantic partner if you have a job. Makes sense. And of those living at home with their parents, more of them are male, 35% of men aged between 18 to 35, as opposed to 29% of women in the same age group. Now, the Atlantic article mentions a multitude of possible reasons for lower sex rates amongst young adults. In addition to the ones already mentioned, the author in her investigations was given explanations to do with hookup culture, economic pressures, surging anxiety rates, psychological frailty, otherwise known as snowflakery, widespread antidepressant use, digital porn, dropping testosterone levels, dating apps, helicopter parenting, careerism, smartphones, information overload, sleep deprivation, obesity, a lack of social skills, increased rate of masturbation, bad sexual experiences, the Me Too movement, and the list goes on. Now, for some time, Japan has been the canary in the coal mine, and having lived there for more than 11 years myself and worked at universities surrounded by young students, I've observed it firsthand. In 2005, a third of Japanese singles between 18 and 34 were virgins. By 2015, that had risen to 43%. One of the reasons cited for this trend in Japan is the rise of the so-called herbivore man, which refers to a lack of ambition sexually and career-wise amongst Japanese men. A government study in 2010 found 61% of unmarried Japanese men did not have a girlfriend, and 45% of those said they were not particularly interested in finding one. And given the downward trending labour force participation rate of young men in the US, they could all be soon turning Japanese. But there's also a unique quirk going on in Western countries that isn't happening in Japan that could also help explain the trend among young adults. According to a November 2017 Economist YouGov poll, 17% of Americans aged 18 to 29 now believe that a man inviting a woman out for a drink always or usually constitutes sexual harassment. I wonder what they think when a woman asks a man out for a drink. Oh, stupid me, that doesn't happen, does it? Laurie Mintz, who teaches a popular undergraduate class on the psychology of sexuality at the University of Florida, told me, the author, that the Me Too movement has made her students much more aware of issues surrounding consent. She's heard from many young men who are productively re-examining their past actions and working diligently to learn from experiences of friends and partners. But others have described less healthy reactions, like avoiding romantic overtures for fear they might be unwelcome. Now, where would they get that idea from, I wonder? Now, that's an interesting paragraph because it implies, of course, that men have to and are changing their behaviour because there is something wrong with the way they have been behaving. There's nothing in this article about the campus rape frenzy and the Title IX kangaroo courts that have resulted in expulsion of young men from colleges without due process and the subsequent record number of lawsuits being filed against these colleges. Nothing on putting the burden of proof for consent on men and the removal of agency from women. Nothing on campus feminists encouraging young women to reinterpret regret sex as sexual assault after the fact. All of which is well documented in this book and which I highly recommend. One woman who described herself as a passionate feminist said she felt empathy for the pressure that heterosexual dating puts on men. I think I owe it to them, in this current cultural moment particularly, to try to treat them like they're human beings, taking a risk, talking to a stranger. There are a lot of lonely, confused people out there who have no idea what to do or how to date. And you being a feminist would be one of them. There's nothing quite like the condescending empathy of a feminist, is there? I wonder what the alternative to treating them like human beings is. Now, my first rule for young males on campus would be to stay clear of anyone calling themselves a feminist. Bettina Arndt went a step further in her talk at the University of Western Australia recently, advising a young male student to stay away from all women on campus. Now, the author also talks about mentioning to several people that she interviewed for this story that she met her husband in an elevator at work. They struck up a conversation, which eventually led to marriage. Here's the interesting part. I was fascinated by the extent to which this prompted other women to sigh and say they'd just love to meet someone that way. And yet quite a few of them suggested that if a random guy started talking to them in an elevator, they would be weirded out. Creeper, get away from me, one woman imagined thinking. Another woman fantasized to me about what it would be like to have a man hit on her in a bookstore. She'd be holding a copy of her favourite book. What's that book, he'd say. Notice the complete lack of imagination of an opening line, because like nearly all women, they have no idea how to chat someone up because they've never had to do it. But then she seemed to snap out of her reverie and change the subject to Sex and the City reruns and how hopelessly dated they seem. And it didn't occur to them, perhaps, in this gender-equal utopia we now inhabit, that they might make an approach. No wonder young men just throw up their hands and say, you know what, I'm not going to play this game. Fortnite sounds like a better option. And think about the effect of that attitude on people getting together. About 18% of 18 to 34-year-olds reported meeting their significant other at work. Toss in some new workplace rules like banning employees from looking at each other for more than 5 seconds, and that statistic is bound to trend lower. Now, we can't dismiss the role of porn, of course, and the related rise in masturbation rates. Apparently, the share of men who reported masturbating doubled from 1992 to 2014, whilst the number of women reporting the same tripled. Now, I think that's probably got something to do with the stigma of rubbing one out largely disappearing, but porn probably has something to do with it, given that in 2014, 43% of men said they'd watched porn in the past week, and I was probably one of them. As I said, there's plenty more in this article worth reading. Speaking for myself, I don't think it's necessarily all bad news. For one thing, teenage pregnancies are at an all-time low, and there are a multitude of ways to keep yourself amused, both sexually and otherwise, that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that trend is only going to increase in the future. But hey, whatever floats your boat. I have no interest in telling anyone what they should or shouldn't do in terms of their sex lives. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.